Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Honoring the Past, Pace, and Ways of Knowing, How to Co-Create Space for Indigenous Ways of Knowing and Being. We are back with the fifth and final webinar in our series, Putting Evidence at the Center of Everyday Life, a global webinar series for citizen leaders and citizen-serving non-governmental organizations. We would like you to note that we are recording this webinar, and the recording and slides will be available next week where you've registered. My name is Clifford Musquash, Minogijagad Bojo Bindagen. I'm pleased to host today's webinar, which is in partnership with the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge at McMaster University. We would like to thank Jennifer Walker and Bernice Downey for being here today to share their insights and lead us through today's discussion. We also welcome Maureen Smith and Tanya Kukanmala for being here today as well. We also have Jen Thornhill Vorma, and Steve Scott behind the scenes producing today's webinar. If everybody has their glass of water that you have been asked to have, I would ask you to have it in front of you right now, and I would like to begin in a good way. So as I indicated, my name is Clifford Musquash. I'm the advisor for the McMaster Health Forum on Indigenous Engagement, and I will begin today in a good way, the way that I have been taught to begin through teachings from my elders. So Bojo and Dinawemagana Dog, Clifford Musquash, Nidijna Kaz, Pagwashi Nidoji, and Nemki Wakwidang Nadojaba. Hello to all my relations, the human relations, the animals, the birds, the fish, the wind, the earth. I live and work in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, who were signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and I'm a member of Pagwasheen, or Pace Plat First Nation, on the North Shore of Lake Superior. So welcome all of our guests and our panelists today, and to be able to greet our spirits in a good way, I ask you to have your glass of water in front of you and follow me as I make a water offering to all of our relations. So we acknowledge all of the spirits that are around us. In Dinawemagana Dog means all of our relations. All of our relations is anybody or anything that has a spirit, anything that has life. Not just the birds and the animals and the fish, but the wind, the earth, and the water itself. I acknowledge that the water that I have is from Lake Superior, and that our water in Lake Superior flows through the Great Lakes River system and eventually ends up in Lake Ontario, near to Hamilton, where my colleagues join me from today. So with our glass of water, I would ask you to remove any kind of jewelry or accoutrements that you might have on yourself, and we're going to go through a water smudge together. So anything that has a spirit is a relation and requires respect and honor, including agreements that are made, such as the treaties. Elders tell us that when we speak words into an agreement, the agreement is given a spirit and needs to be respected and honored the same way as a human relation. Water also contains energy and a spirit. It gives us life, and all of our relations, the energy it needs to sustain itself. So with our water, if we can just dip our hands, our fingers into the water and just kind of cleanse your hands with that water. If we had medicines in a burning, in a smudge, we would be taking that smoke to cleanse our hands. So we do that with the water. We dip fingers and smudge our eyes and ask that our eyes be open to new perspectives. We can smudge our minds, our forehead, through our temples, and ask for our minds to be open so that we can be mindful of the words that we have, the things that we say. We smudge our ears so that we can hear truth. We smudge our nose so that we can smell the gift of creation. Hair contains our memories, so we can smudge our hair as well. We can smudge our extremities like our arms. And as you're doing this, you're dipping. We can smudge our hearts so that our hearts can be open, so that we can be brave, that we can be honest with ourselves, with those around us. And finally, after we've done smudging ourselves with the water, what we can do is we can take a sip of that water. And taking in that energy of the water and that spirit, we're mindful of the willingness to be able to speak with humility and love, to be able to speak our truth with honesty, from our hearts, to be brave and honest, to be able to give and receive respect. Water contains energy. We absorb that energy when we drink water. We expel that energy through our tears, through perspiration, respiration, urination. And when our energy that we put into our water goes back to the earth is then able to receive that energy and know what it is that we need from the earth and from the spirits and our relations around us. So with that, I say miigwech for joining us today. It is a good day, and we will get on with our program this afternoon. You can leave your water by you for the duration of our program today, and towards the end of our time together, at the end of the presentation, you can finish consuming your water. That water absorbs the energy that's around you and the teachings that surround it as well. So it's important to have that near to you today through our session. Our webinar series that we are offering in the 5th iteration today is co-hosted by Cochrane, the Global Evidence Commission, and the World Health Organization's Evidence-Informed Policy Network. And with this session, we're pleased to welcome the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge as a partner as well. To recap our sessions so far in the series, we're pleased to be going deeper into the topic that Bernice introduced in session 4, bringing a focus in these discussions to Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. I think it's also important to note that to date, through our webinar series, we've had thousands of participants join us live, as well as many more view the recordings as well. As we hear from our speakers today, Jennifer and Bernice, we encourage you, the participants, to share your reflections and questions in the chat feature. We're reserving time for your questions. We will be collecting all of the chat content to summarize at a high level the key themes of your reflections and questions to share along with the recordings of today's webinar. Today's webinar, although it's the 5th, and final, is not the end of this conversation, but the next chapter in our work together and broadly. And with that, I will hand things over to Jennifer Walker and Bernice Downey. Miigwech.
Ani, Buju, greetings all. Thank you, Clifford, for that beautiful opening. So important, the issue of our water globally. Indigenous peoples have really been carrying that message for a very, very long time, and how lovely for you to help us be mindful of our responsibilities and how closely we are connected to the water. And I'm ever so mindful. Today, I just got a message that a new little baby has been born into our family, and it's a little boy. His name is Noah, and he comes from the waters of his mother and his grandmother, who is my close family member. So that water teaching was very special today, miigwech. So without further ado, thank you again to all the Global Evidence webinar folks, the planning team, all the hard work that's gone into this. It's great to be back, and it's great to be co-hosting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Learning Lodge, but I also just will say in my language that I am not a fluent speaker, but I like to use a few words as it is an ongoing learning process, and our language is so important to the work we do, our worldview and our perspectives in health, education, research, and so forth. So I say Buju, Minagijigan, Bernice Downey, Niganakwe Dejijnakaz, Baji Ganing Nadijnakas, Lake St. Martin, Dauphin River, Nujunjaba, Megwadinda, Ontario, Gawin, Inigagan, Mazi, Nindudem, Anishinaabe, Kwe, Endau. Greetings, it's a beautiful day. My name is Bernice Downey. I've also been given the name of head woman or Niganakwe. I'm a proud Ojibwe Saulteaux woman. I do not have a clan at this time, but my family ties are with Lake St. Martin and Dauphin River First Nations in the Treaty 2 area of Manitoba. However, I have been residing and collaborating with Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people of Hamilton, Ontario, London, Ontario, in the Treaty 29 area, and the Indigenous groups indigenous to this land. And I'll just turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walker, to introduce herself.
Sego, thank you so much, Clifford, for that opening. It was wonderful and really connected, grounded. So I appreciate that so much. And I love that image of us being connected by the water. I'm Jen Walker. I'm Haudenosaunee and a member of 6 Nations of the Grand River. So that is the First Nation community closest to where we are here in Hamilton and the traditional territory where I am. So I am really excited to be here. I think like the obsession of my life is evidence and development and using evidence for the decision-making of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of that journey with you today. So I'm at McMaster University. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact, and also work within the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge as the research lead. And Bernice is going to be talking a little bit about that. I also have a Canada Research Chair, Tier 2 in Indigenous Health Data and Aging, which sort of merges my interests in epidemiology. I'm an epidemiologist by background, and data training, as well as a focus on aging, brain health, and dementia in my research.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. I'll mention that the work of the development of the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge, which is situated within the Faculty of Health Science at McMaster University here in Ontario, province of Ontario, Canada, and resides on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe lands. And my work over the past 7 years as the Indigenous Health Lead and then the inaugural Associate Dean Indigenous Health was to co-lead the development of the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge and a strategy for the faculty. And this was in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's work that called on medical and nursing schools in our country to be responsive to their calls to action. And so this was culminated in the faculty's commitment to do this work. I have spent many years as a registered nurse working in different areas and more recently returned to graduate school for a medical anthropology PhD. I focus on harmonizing health systems, and I also hold a chair in Indigenous women's heart health. Next slide, please. So in the spirit of two-row teaching in the Faculty of Health Science at McMaster, we have collectively manifested the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge. You can see the translation of the name there, both in Anishinaabe, the first title, and in Haudenosaunee Mohawk language. And we work very closely with our Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee partners, our senior leaders, faculty, staff, and learners on campus. And that's what I mean by collective. The first year was only about relationship building. And it was important to establish the trust between community and the academy to move past many negative experiences of discrimination, racism, and poor access to healthcare services. And so it culminated in the development of a very comprehensive overall strategy. I'll go to slide 4 now, and resulted in our what we call our Indigenous Health Initiative, or IHI, mission statement, which I'm not going to read to you, but just point out that, again, to be responsive to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's overall goal of responding to the significant health disparities that exist between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. And the faculty, as mentioned, was committed and responsive to the advisement that the implementation be comprehensive and be a whole of faculty Indigenous health initiative. We'd had many incremental changes in various areas of the academy, including research, but had not had this whole faculty comprehensive approach. And so we strive to do our work in a self-determining way. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of our structure. You can see our learners or our students are at the center, supporting them through their various pathways of both undergraduate and graduate level studies. And you can see on the bottom left that we have a research hub and our overall goal with Jen being our director or our research hub lead in engaging with, for example, our research ethics boards, our vice dean research, other faculty researchers or clinical researchers to address certain priorities related to Indigenous health research reform. And you can see some of our other priorities as part of the strategy there. Next slide, please. And so this is just a bit of an overview of our talk today. We basically want to provide a little bit of historical perspective, which led to a process of pausing in terms of Indigenous health research and a reclamation process. We'll talk a bit about gathering internationally, nationally, and regionally. Jen will talk a bit about initiating Indigenous research principles and guidelines, strengthening our systems, working together with the mainstream community, essentially addressing the how do we do that, and then the importance of relational accountability and non-interference. Now, I will do a time check because we did start a few minutes late, and we do want to reserve some time for questions. And so I just want to do a time check, Clifford, as to how much time we have available now.
You have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
Okay, very good. All right, so I just want to start that. Okay, so next slide, please. So this just talks about the dilemma and the tensions between the Western scientific community, if you will, and the Indigenous community. And we want to note that, of course, that as it stands now, although we are in some transitional reform, that Western scientific or mainstream knowledge translation and ways of doing research is rooted in Western scientific paradigms. And the implication for Indigenous populations is that Indigenous knowledge cannot be verified by scientific criteria, nor can science be adequately assessed according to the tenets of Indigenous knowledge. Each is built on different philosophies, methodologies, and criteria. For example, according to one of our esteemed philosophers and academics, Leroy Littlebear, who's from the native Blackfoot tribe in Canada, he talks about the native Blackfoot paradigm and the foundational base or the notion of constant flux as a concept, that it is so embodied in the mind. And flux is an idea where everything is in constant motion. Whereas in Western science and quantum physics, perhaps, they do talk about constant motion and flux as well. Another part of the paradigm is energy waves, which Dr. Baer describes as a different thought than native thought. In quantum physics, everything is about matter, whereas in native thought, everything is about waves. And he refers to that as translating to the notion of spirit. And that is why Indigenous peoples are so closely associated to spirituality. They're also closely associated with everything inanimate, including trees, rocks, water, as we heard today. And in quantum physics, they don't want to say it out loud, as Dr. Littlebear describes, because of fear of criticism. But in their labs, they do agree that those subatomic particles do know are aware, and without going to it double blind experiments, maybe those participants are aware of this. So the key point here, I guess, is that there is some intersection, but there's also very much a difference in Indigenous ways of knowing in science and in Western concepts. And so the Mason Dury, another prominent Maori scholar, contests that there's not really a lot to be learned from positioning ourselves as different. And contests about the validities of the two systems tend to serve as distractions from explorations of the interface and the subsequent opportunities for creating new knowledge that reflects the dual persuasions. So I like to talk about it in my work as harmonization, something that upholds and respects. And Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about Haudenosaunee two-row wampum approach a little bit further in the presentation. So suffice to say that there are differences, there is intersection, and it's really to all of our benefits to explore this interface. And so I'll pass it over to Jen now for the next slide on deficit-based approaches. Jen?
Thanks, Bernice. So one of the risks that happens when we think about this sort of basis of basing Indigenous research or Indigenous policies that impact Indigenous people on evidence that is grounded in Western approaches, is one of the risks is that we end up with deficit-based approaches. As a trained epidemiologist, I'm super familiar with this idea of like the referent category and comparing to, and you know, it's sort of the binary of good and bad, and you want to show the relationships to outcomes. I use a lot of administrative health data that gets generated by the healthcare system. So it's a lot of, you know, do people end up with this diagnosis, or people experiencing this risk factor? This kind of research that's grounded in a deficit-based approach is often used to advance a discourse of difference, disparity, disadvantage, dysfunction, and deprivation. And it wasn't me who came up with the nice 5Ds, the easy to remember 5Ds. That's Maggie Walter, but an Indigenous scholar from Tasmania. So I think that can you just click? I think there's another yes. So the challenge with this is not just that we keep emphasizing the differences and we keep you know, telling negative stories about Indigenous communities. It actually has very real implications when we stereotype and further marginalize Indigenous people, and it poses a risk for actually individual people who are seeking services. And we've seen that play out in Canada. We've seen the embedded racism that gets emphasized by deficit-based research that then impacts the way that people are treated in hospital emergency departments, devastating consequences at times. And so really, we need a shift. We need a way forward out of telling negative stories about Indigenous communities. And I'll say, like, you know, when we, it's almost a natural tendency in the way that we're trained as researchers in Western science systems to do this. And one of the things I often see is people saying, we'd like to make a map of the province, and we'd like to show with different colors where the highest rates of certain things are, highest rates of heart disease, highest rates of injury, those kinds of things. And the ones that show up in bright red are always the places that are Indigenous communities. And I don't understand in some ways how we can think that will help by showing it over and over again. It just continues to tell people that their experiencing things that they see around them every day. And it's like being told you look sick every day, you know? And so it's really this, this need to, and this is where you click the button for the next slide, be shifting, shifting to Indigenous-led approaches that help us get away from using research to shine a light on problems, to Indigenous peoples holding that light, to use research to find and guide a path forward. So it's about self-determination. So we know that we have experienced decades of stories about Indigenous people from a deficit lens. And so we, like, collectively know we need a different path forward. And so, you know, this isn't starting now. This is starting back a few steps where, you know, this conversation has been happening in Indigenous communities for a long time. I'm going to shift back to Bernice to tell you a little bit about that.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so I just want a little bit of a background on some of the international work, since we are talking to our international colleagues here today. And so we do acknowledge that there's more than 370 million Indigenous people in some 70 countries worldwide, and that we are demanding greater data sovereignty and challenging the way in which Indigenous data has been used by government and other stakeholders to develop policies and programs. And this is seen by the development of international networks, such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous People. The Permanent Forum is the UN's central coordinating body for matters relating to the concerns and rights of the world's Indigenous peoples. And it was established July 28, 2000, with the mandate to deal with Indigenous issues related to economic, social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights, and is considered the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples. UNDRIP, as we call it, the acronym, establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples in the world, and elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of Indigenous peoples. And so it was adopted in 2007 by a majority of the 144 states. There were 4 votes against the vote at that time, and that was Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. And when I talk about it here in my country, I acknowledge that at the time, the common factor between all 4 countries was that there were, in our country, we would have a liberal and conservative government, but all of these countries were colonized by Britain, and at the time, all of them had conservative governments in place. And so after Canada had been at the table for 25 years developing UNDRIP, to come to voting against was really challenging for Indigenous peoples. And in the end, it was adopted when our government changed. And even though it is non-binding, and we did eventually sign on, a few years later, government determined they would sign on to the outcome document as well, which is a commitment to implementing the articles of UNDRIP. And so this is all very hopeful. Again, it's non-binding, but what the international instrument does result in is an opportunity for Indigenous peoples to use it in a way that moves the needle forward. And in this case, in terms of how we do research and how we are harmonizing our ways of knowing with Western dominant ways. And so specific to this dialogue today is Article 31 in UNDRIP, which says that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences. And it goes on to expand on that a bit, but that is the central part here, is the manifestation of our own sciences. And it also calls on member states should take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. So the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health was another international process that took place between 2005 and 2008. I had the honor of participating on the Canadian Reference Group, which supported our commissioners, the Right Honorable Monique Bégin, who was a former health minister, and Stephen Lewis. And the commission was established by the WHO in 2005 to support countries and global health partners in addressing the social factors leading to ill health and health inequities. And the commission aimed to draw the attention of governments and society to the determinants of health and create and address the social conditions and other factors that were affecting vulnerable people. It delivered its final report in July 2008 and subsequently sunsetted. Now, the overarching recommendations of the Commission were to improve daily living conditions, tackle the inequitable distributions of power, money, and resources, measure and understand the problem, and assess the impact of action. Important to note, as a participant we called for an Indigenous specific gathering, which occurred in Adelaide during the Commission's mandate years. And at that gathering, Indigenous peoples wanted the final report to include a chapter on Indigenous peoples, and they identified that the two most important determinants were land and self-determination. So mention of those two determinants got into the final report, but in a text box, not a chapter. And so it was challenging after such an in-depth, rich dialogue to be able to convey it all. But anyway, that kind of process did support Indigenous peoples from various countries to engage with their governments, to call on both UNDRIP and the WHO report, and to uphold our aspirations and our goals to create change and address health inequity amongst our people, for ourselves, with others. And so a world report in January 2024 called for a paper summarizing progress towards the Commission's report. And that was passed by the executive board, and it is to be completed this year, taking into account feedback that has been received as part of consultations. And so it remains to be seen, how we will align with the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, particularly to the report on leaving nobody behind, and those series of 20 consultations. I didn't see one that was specific to Indigenous peoples, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what that report holds. So again, key points here: a number of international processes have been underway for a number of years that many Indigenous peoples around the world have contributed to. We have identified our priorities. We have established our rights. For some of us, our member states there has been some uptake, but it does remain to be seen how system reform that Jen is now going to talk about a bit more is contributing to this change and how we are self-determining this process. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Bernice. I was so intrigued, involved, that I forgot I had to talk.
And we are, just for our slide person, we are on slide 11 now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great story, Jen. And that was our goal here, was to really tell the story of how we have paused and reclaimed. And that is the story behind those processes. It's not perfect. It's not generating the change at the pace that we need, but we are making progress, which I know you're going to talk a bit about it.
Yeah, and I want to just even go back a little bit further in time. So those dates that were up on the slide in the last slide, even before that, in the 1990s, First Nations, not Fist Nations, I apologize, I must have deleted an R somehow. The First Nations across Canada became leaders in Indigenous data governance conversations globally. And and really started to question the kinds of research and data gathering that was happening in First Nations communities about First Nations communities and people, that wasn't actually building towards self-determination and sovereignty of First Nations. And so back in the 1990s, these principles of First Nations data governance, which are that First Nations data need to be owned, controlled, accessed, and possessed by First Nations. And that is a fundamental shift. And I remember when I was first, around that time, I was an undergraduate student. I was starting grad school, and I remember people telling me at that time, don't try and do First Nations research because OCAP it's people saw it like a big stop sign, like that means there's no access to First Nations data. Fortunately, over time, I have understood this to be more of guidance and a roadmap to First Nations data rather than a block. And really, it's saying these are the rules. These are the rules for First Nations data, that First Nations have rights to ownership, control, access, and possession, and to control how their information is used for research and other purposes. So in some ways, you can understand it as sort of the parameters for First Nations data. And they're still very much part of the dialogue now. So this came in, these principles began, they've resulted in First Nations led data collection in First Nations communities in multiple surveys, and the formation of the First Nations Information Governance Center, which is a wonderful place to go and learn about First Nations data governance, First Nations data sovereignty, and to take training on the OCAP principles if you're interested. So emerging from that, please go to the next slide. Emerging from that conversation became another international conversation, specifically around Indigenous data. And the idea that these kinds of principles that have been so well organized and articulated in Canada apply around the world, but maybe in different ways. So this process to come forward in particular, so these CARE principles, I want to put them into some context. You may have seen them before. They are principles for Indigenous data governance that emerged as a response to FAIR principles. So FAIR principles, if you haven't heard them, are research data principles that say all research data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. They're really about open data, and that research data collected once should be reused, should be open, that kind of thing. And, as Indigenous community members from around the world we're listening to this discourse and listening to this advancement of the ideas and concepts around open science, open data, the response to those principles had to be that, yes, if you have Indigenous data, there are other responsibilities that you have to Indigenous communities in the use of that data. So the CARE principles articulate 4 sets of principles around Indigenous data. There should be collective benefit, that it has to be able to be used by Indigenous communities, that there's Indigenous authority to control, that there's responsibility of the researchers, the responsibility of those collecting the data, is that it supports self-determination and a collective benefit, and thinking about Indigenous ways of thinking about ethics, justice, that kind of thing. So if you can go to the next slide, what I really want to emphasize here is that Indigenous data sovereignty might look different, actually play out a bit differently in different contexts around the world. It is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. It's a right of Indigenous nations. It's also a responsibility. So when you see people rising to that responsibility, Indigenous nations rising to the responsibility to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data, that is an act of self-determination itself, that rising to that responsibility. So it's a really important conversation about why data would be even collected about Indigenous peoples. If you can go to the next slide. I want to just emphasize that, and this is from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is what the group that developed the CARE principles became. So that Global Indigenous Data Alliance is a wonderful source for information about Indigenous rights and data. But this importance of not only having governance of the data, Indigenous nations need to be able to govern data, research, information about their people, but also that they have to be able to use that data for governance. That is their responsibility. So they have the right and the responsibility. And the same goes for, so when you're seeing this, when we're thinking about putting evidence at the center of everyday life, for Indigenous nations, that means using information, data, research to guide decision-making, that their own decision-making for their own self-determination. And so it really doesn't, it really takes away that sort of potentially paternalistic view that, you know, it's that Indigenous nations need to be scooped up and saved, really. And that comes from a deficit-based approach to storytelling that makes us think, that makes people think that Indigenous nations and people and communities need to be saved. Really, what is required is this cycle of governing data about their nation so that they can use it for governance and decision-making. I just have one more thing that I want to share in the next slide, and that is that there are paths forward. There are many potential paths forward that should be grounded in the nations and the traditional knowledge of the people that you know, if you're, I see so many people coming from different parts of the world and different parts of Canada, that there will be different frameworks for thinking about how we co-create space together, to be able to put evidence in the center of everyday life, to be able to honor the past, to honor the pace of working together. Sometimes that's quick and sometimes that's slow, and to honor Indigenous ways of knowing. And one of the ones that we've really been thinking about a lot at the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge, and that I think about a lot, is this image that's depicted here of the two-row wampum. And Bernice talked a bit about that before. She alluded to this two-row wampum. And really, the two-row wampum is a model. It's an agreement, actually. It's not just a model. It's an agreement that was made between Haudenosaunee people and early settlers who were Dutch. And it represented an acknowledgement of cultural and ideological differences and how they could work in harmony. So one of those rows is the canoe of the Haudenosaunee people who are traveling along the river. And then the other row is the path of the ship of the Dutch settlers that's traveling along the same river. Those two paths don't intersect with each other. They don't overwhelm one another. They don't become one. They travel, not interfering with each other, in self-determination beside one another. But there is that opportunity to be able to work in that space in between. So those white rows around and between those two distinct paths of settlers and Indigenous people who were here represent those good thoughts, good words, good actions, so that we can find ways of working together at the same time as honoring our own self-determination and not interfering with one another. So I just want to go to the next slide and say thank you so much for the opportunity to share this story with you. And Bernice, do you have any last words before we pass back to Clifford?
Sorry, couldn't get my my mute button unmuted. No, that's great. Thank you, Jen. In the interest of time, we'll just move forward with questions.
Miigwech, Jen, and Bernice for your presentation and for that wisdom and knowledge that you've shared with us. As you were talking, Bernice, talking about the importance of relationship building and showing the diagram of the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge, I was reminded about the importance of community and really surrounding each other with community and the bundles that we all carry within our community as well. And talking about the dynamicism of knowledge between both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people reminds me that our people are and have always been scientific. Whether it's been acknowledged and accredited by Western science and Western ways of knowing. And Jen spoke about the responsibility of researchers with the care principles. And it harkened back for me to teachings that I had received from an elder that says that when we receive teachings and when we receive knowledge, we then also, in tandem with receiving that knowledge, receive the responsibility for that knowledge, to use that knowledge in a way that is good and beneficial for our people and for our community. So wrapped into, you know, those OCAP principles and the care principles is that inherent responsibility as well. So Miigwech for your knowledge and sharing with us today. For our participants, we have an opportunity now to engage in conversation, a dialogue. Had this not been a virtual setting, I'm sure that we would have been seated in a circle the way that our people do. For the Haudenosaunee, they circle opposite the way that Ojibwe people circle. Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe circle the way of the sun or clockwise, as people who still have an analog clock would know. The circle is an equalizer. The circle requires humility for us to be able to sit side by side and be able to see the faces of all of those that we share circle with. And that when we come to circle as individuals, as spirits, as relations that bring bundles and knowledge and not necessarily expertise. We bring the teachings that we have and are able to share those with our circle. So we want to replicate that today. So we do have questions that are being kind of coalesced through the chat and reflections as well. And so we'll start our sharing today, our session, sharing some of our questions, starting with those of some of our partners. And if I can, I'll ask Maureen to, there we go, come into circle and share her question with us.
Thank you so much, Clifford, and thank you, Bernice and Jen, for an extremely enlightening and interesting presentation, and it just reminds me every time how much I have to learn. So, Jen, I appreciated your explanation about data sovereignty and the history, and with Bernice with the history behind it and all that. And I'm wondering, how do we bring about that same sovereignty to other forms of evidence, like be it behavioral insights or qualitative research?
Well, thanks so much for that. And really, like, I guess when we say data sovereignty, it really applies to all kinds of data. Even when we think about like a systematic literature review or something like that, what's the data in a systematic literature review? That is all the published literature. So we have to think about how do we honor the knowledge of where each of those studies came from when they're Indigenous nations who are producing those findings, and then how do we make sure that we're honoring Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledges in a knowledge synthesis process. So it doesn't just pertain to data. It pertains to all of the things we do with knowledge in research, in policy development. So really, like when we're using Indigenous methodologies, we're always thinking about that integration of Indigenous knowledges and not imposing a way of accessing knowledge. And particularly important is traditional knowledge, like traditional ecological knowledge, other kinds of medicine knowledges that really shouldn't be shared. But if they are shared, they might be shared just in certain circumstances. So, you know, it really is, it takes some deep insight. I don't think that there's like a checklist that we can go through, but I would say in terms of those kinds of principles, they apply across.
Thanks so much, Jen. I really like the looking at data holistically, because we tend not to do that. We tend to put it in boxes, and as a patient and as a citizen, that holistic approach really rings true for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maureen, for that question. We have a question from Meryl in the Netherlands, who asks, is our way of producing scientific evidence a Western way of thinking? And would that fit in any way to Indigenous ways of thinking? Jen or Bernice, if you're able to address that.
I'll just have a couple of comments, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Jen. You know, when you mentioned in just your reflections at the end of our talk there, Clifford, and you said you were mindful of how Indigenous peoples, we are researchers in our own right. We have always been researchers, because observation of the world around us and understanding and accountability and fostering those relationships with both the animate and the inanimate, as I quoted Dr. Littlebear, was essential for our survival. So from a Western approach, I mean, there are many examples of how mainstream Western scientists have turned to Indigenous people's understanding of ecology, and when we're a global with a global concern around climate change at the moment, Indigenous peoples have that relationship with the land, the water, and deep knowledge that's been shared across a millennia about how we are to care for Mother Earth and all that she brings to us. So that essence of who we are as scientists, as observers, our interdependency and connection to the world around us is our foundation of science. And so I'm always mindful. I'll just share this little story about how we have created an undergraduate Indigenous Research Scholars Program. We'll be celebrating 10 years next year. And so we invite undergraduate students to learn more about what it's like to be in graduate school, and it's focused on research. And it amazes me what these young people come prepared with, the inquiry, the questions that they have. And one example that's always stuck with me is one young girl wanted her area of inquiry to be about why the black bears are coming into town in her northern community, and they've never seen them before. And they're making a link to climate change and the fact that the blueberries are not as prolific in the bush as they were for the bears. And female bears, need the blueberries and all that they carry in their nourishment, so as not to abort their young when they're in hibernation. And that blew me away, that she came as a young woman with that area of inquiry that was important, not just to her, but to her community. And that addressing that question and trying to find out the link to climate change, and then advocating for what needs to happen in climate change, that's science. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Bernice. The one thing I'll add is, like, I didn't give up epidemiology to do Indigenous research. We can use tools and learnings from Western science and other ways of thinking, but we use methodologies, Indigenous methodologies of relationality and responsibility and holism to be able to guide how we use those tools. So, I mean, I do multiple logistic regression, I do looking at rates and, all sorts of things that I was trained to do as an epidemiologist, but at the same time, I've been involved in ceremony for the people whose data we're using, for example. We've done lots of work to understand the context, to be working in relation to the environment, to people living in communities right now, people who have passed, future generations to come. So it's about an approach, I think, more than it is about our way of producing scientific evidence. If it's grounded in a different way, can still be very useful.
Thanks, Jen and Bernice. As you were responding, what was coming to me were thoughts about, ontology and epistemology, which was going to be the foundation of a thesis I was going to write before I had left my graduate studies, and maybe with the excitement of today's topic, might be something I consider getting back to sooner than maybe I was going to. But we have another question from another one of our partners, Tanya. Actually has two questions that are in line with the idea of honoring the past in ways of knowing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cliff. And Bernice and Jennifer, thanks a lot for your really inspiring, rich, and so insightful presentation, and also responses that you already gave. My first question is with regard to matching pace, and really, how can we build trust and relationships with Indigenous communities to support the co-creation of new evidence, both by and with them, while relying on processes and the pace that respects Indigenous self-determination, rights, perspectives, and also ways of knowing and doing?
I can start with a couple of comments, Jen, unless you wanted to start.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I think that, in any project or engagement or research study with Indigenous peoples, it's all about relationships and then protocol. And also the understanding that diversity is an important concept to consider, because like even in Canada here, our three recognized Indigenous groups are First Nations, Inuit from the north, and Métis. And so Métis people are not going to be happy if you go in with protocols that are grounded in First Nations worldview. So we have to be careful of diversity and unique self-determining ways in research. The relationship often takes time to build, and many a sorry person who's gone in with a cold call to ask somebody in the 11th hour to participate in a research study that they think will be perfect for their community, but have not built in the time to develop a relationship or to identify their own protocols. So it's really very specific to whatever group that you are working with. It does take time. And I know for myself that, establishing a community relationship agreement, some type of project charter, or just an agreement is an important aspect of the relationship too. And that helps to build the trust. It's negotiated with the group that you're working with. We are shifting in Canada, where now our three funding agencies are recognizing that these things don't always happen the way the institutions or the academy says they need to happen. But that we need to engage Indigenous peoples far earlier into the relationship so that they are actually part of the ethics application, for example. So trust building, taking the time to foster those relationships, and negotiating protocols and supporting community to participate in these initiatives. So one thing I strive for in my research, as many of my colleagues do, is to build in resources for a community liaison or mechanisms that reduce the burden on the community. There are so many priorities, and many times my research or my colleagues' research is not up there yet. And so, yeah, we have to be cognizant of the pace and the protocols that are important to build into the relationship building. Jen?
I think when it comes to building trust, it's like being trustworthy, right? Like you just want to be a trustworthy partner, friend, someone who's not only looking for their own benefit. You know, like if you think about a relationship with a person, you want to build that kind of relationship with people. And I think it's not super technical, you know, it's like being in the spaces, listening and following through on commitments and not being extractive. Like these are really fundamental and not really complex, but they are different from how we're trained as researchers and policymakers. And I think I just want to make a comment about the pace, because sometimes the pace feels, and like the general narrative is that it takes longer and it's slow. And that is true at the beginning. It takes a long time to build the kind of trust that you need to be able to respond quickly. But I just wanted to say, like, a small example. Well, it turned, you know, it's an important example, but there was one of the groups that I work with, it holds the administrative data for the province we live in Ontario. So all the hospital data, the physician data, they also were holding the vaccination for COVID data. And so they were producing reports for the government early on. But we had been building a relationship for 10 years and had a data governance agreement with the Chiefs of Ontario, the First Nations in Ontario, over 10 years of relationship building, figuring out how to work together, figuring out how to make sure that OPAP was embedded in the work that we did. And then when COVID hit, it was like, I think the first report that we gave to chiefs, the chiefs, so the 133 First Nations chiefs got their report in May for the testing data for the pandemic that started in March. So it didn't take long because we had relationship building. So sometimes the pace has to be really quick because it's your job to be fast at that point in the relationship. Sometimes, you know, it can change. So I guess that's why it's not, you know, the advice isn't stay slow. The advice is match the pace.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks a lot, Jennifer and Bernice, for pointing out the pace that sometimes is slow, but can also be accelerated. But trust building and relationship building definitely needs time, respect, and also the diversity that you point out, to not just look into one size fits all, but really going to the granular, which is again respect, right? And core to relationship building. Thanks a lot. The second question I have is again to both of you. With regard to applying Indigenous ways of knowing. So how can we co-create the spaces where Indigenous people's voices leads the way with diverse oral history and worldviews that are passed on through teachings and stories over a millennia? So that would be my second question.
If I understand you correctly, I think you're referencing my comment about how what we know about the world around us and our teachings and so forth is passed on through generations. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Very important question, and it is sometimes challenging for us in the academy and in the research community, because what we know as our truth is passed on in contemporary society. It's passed on in both oral and written traditions now. Many of our scholars are working hard in academia and are writing papers and dissertations and aspiring to integrate their own ways of doing things, but it's challenging. There was a time in research and in education, in many different sectors, where the oral teachings that were passed on were considered to be folklore or narrative, and really minimized in the research world as not really documenting and the truth in a scientific way. And you know, research is being done. You can find it out there, sometimes within the anthropology community, who, in their methods of qualitative research, carefully documented engagement with community members on various aspects of their lives and their ways of knowing. And people who have now gone back into those archived articles and notes, you know, that have begun to see a trend where people can recognize a teaching that they are very familiar with in contemporary society. But we don't necessarily need that in order to believe a teaching that has been passed to us from another generation. So we hold the oral tradition in our songs, in our ceremonies, in just in a circle process that was already referenced as a truth. And that's why we talked about, you know, upholding our own truth and having it as a self-determining guide for the work that we know is important and meaningful to us and our people. So it's a very big question that you ask, but I think we're very confident about the teachings that we've that have passed on. I think there is probably some worry about how those teachings have been interrupted because of the impact of colonization, our residential schools, the fact that we were not allowed to speak or share our languages, and that a lot of our knowledge and stories, traditions, and ceremonies are in the language. And so we worry, we have been worried for a long time about our fluent language speakers. There's, you know, not a whole lot of them left. And so there's a great resurgence to reclaim our languages, the concepts and the teachings that are in the language, to ensure that we protect them. So those are just a few of my own reflections, and perhaps Jen or Clifford or somebody else would like to address that as well.
That's okay, Clifford, you go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. No, I wasn't going to address that, but I do echo what you're saying. Bernice, thank you. And Tanya, thank you for those questions. We have about 5 minutes remaining in our webinar, and we've got 2 questions that we would like to get to. So I'll pose the first question to Bernice and the second to Jennifer. So the first question is from Awe, and they ask, are there mechanisms, Bernice, put in place to make sure Indigenous people are actually benefiting from the Indigenous research? And if so, how are they involved, and at what level do they get involved? And to Jen, from Karen right out, they say, I really appreciate the importance of taking an assets instead of deficits-based approach to using and communicating knowledge. I would love to hear more of your thoughts on how to talk about the importance of addressing the upstream factors that contribute to health inequities. So we only have a few minutes left. And with that, I would ask Bernice to respond to the first question.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Clifford. I would just briefly say that, you know, when we talk about the whole notion of knowledge translation or research uptake, I'll speak for myself, but I know there's other colleagues concerned around these issues. And that is that while we are getting more recognition of important topics that we want to research, like Indigenous knowledge or language, or there's so many things that were not recognized by scientific research bodies or funders. And now that is slowly starting to change. But the challenge that we experience is how that knowledge is being translated. I refer to a cultural dissonance, and have been working with the Cardiology Network, the scientific community, to address this, so that our research doesn't sit on a shelf because the scientific community in that particular network is not educated about Indigenous peoples and don't feel confident enough to take that research and harmonize it into how we approach Indigenous women, in this case, with cardiovascular illness. So we had a fabulous meeting just a week ago with the scientific research community of the Heart and Stroke Foundation, who sat and listened and took part in ceremony and circle process and have committed to pick up the momentum and figure out how they need to translate this knowledge differently. And so it's not perfect yet is the short answer. But as Jen referenced earlier, our OCAP framework does recognize who owns the data, who owns that information from study findings, and what we do with it. So if we're collaborating with people, we also have a say in what needs to happen with the findings and the outcomes from the study.
Miigwech, Bernice. Jen, the second question was to you about more being able to look more to the upstream factors contributing to health inequities.
Yeah, and I guess there's so many things you could say about this, but I'll just say this one thing. I think it's really important to center Indigenous knowledges in how we talk about upstream factors. So one example is we were looking at modules for brain health promotion that had been developed, and they kept talking about a Mediterranean diet. We unpacked that with communities in Southern Saskatchewan, First Nation communities, and we were like, okay, it's like omega-3, like there's reasons why a Mediterranean diet, and they were like, well, we get that from muskrat, and we get that from this, and so that's a strengths and asset-based way of having the conversation about nutrition and brain health, instead of saying, oh, you don't have olives? And maybe you should be getting this kind of fish, you know, like really, it's really important to be grounding it and centering it in the strengths and knowledge in communities.
Yeah. Having specific approaches to each of our communities and really working within kind of the bundle that they have and seeking what those tools are is what I'm hearing you say, Jen. I really want to thank you, Jen and Bernice, for contributing to our webinar series today. In closing, I want to bring us back to the water. I want to, in doing this, I want to say miigwech to Bernice and Jen, and to Jen and Steve, Maureen, Tanya, and our other question and reflection offerers today. I want us to remember that our water has energy and that our bodies have lots of water to it. And so I invite you to finish your glass of water in your own time as we close this afternoon, with honor and thanks to the spirit and the energy that water contains. My wish to you is that you absorb that good medicine that is Nebe as you walk across Mamaiki, or Mother Earth, as my people say. Thank you to our speakers again and our participants for joining us today. Please stay tuned for the recording of today's webinar. And with that, I say Bamapi to everybody. In our language, in Anishinaabe, we don't say goodbye, we say Bamapi, which is to say until the next time. So Bamapi, everybody, miigwech.